I can't understand you. I ask you to start filming from the feet slowly up to the head. And you go zip, pan. Bloody hell, don't you ever watch movies? You must see thousands of movies. You must know what it's like. They're training chimpanzees at Cape Canaveral to operate a camera. Anybody...
On the 4th of February 1983, a London man wrote a letter to his estate agents complaining that the drains in his flat were blocked and that the situation for him and other tenants in the building had become too bad to handle. This was an incredibly foolish mistake made by a deranged killer who had heartlessly preyed on over 20 young men and boys in the previous 5 years and flushed the remains down his toilet. In today's video, we will be discussing a truly horrific case of Britain's most prolific at the time serial killer, Dennis Nilsen, also known as the Kindly Killer. We will be exploring the depths of his depraved mind, as well as the reason why he decided to take the actions that he did. Dennis Andrew Nilsen was born on the 23rd of November 1945 in the beautiful county of Aberdeenshire in Scotland. He was the middle child and had 2 siblings, an older brother and a younger sister. He was described as a quiet but adventurous child, nothing like the man he would grow to become. Nilsen's earliest childhood memories were of family picnics in the Scottish countryside with his mother and siblings, as well as being taken on long countryside walks with his grandfather, who he described as his great hero and as his protector. These were the happiest moments of the young boy's life, a life that would result in misery and death for many of the men who he would later interact with. By the time Nilsen was 6 in 1951, his grandfather's health had begun to deteriorate, but he continued to earn a living as a fisherman, knowing that he needed to support his family, including his daughter and his grandchildren, who still lived at home with him and his wife. On October the 31st of the same year, whilst working out at sea, he suffered a massive heart attack and passed away at the age of 62. His body was brought ashore and the family was informed. The news devastated the entire family, but nobody took this news as hard as Nilsen's mother. In what Nilsen would later describe as his most vivid childhood memory, his mother, crying so hard that he thought her eyes might fall out, asked the young Dennis if he wanted to see his grandfather so that he may say his goodbyes. As Nilsen gazed upon the body, the image was burnt into his mind, leaving an imprint that he would never forget. His mother told him that his grandfather was now sleeping and that his soul had gone to a better place. Nilsen felt lost after losing his only hero and role model, and in the years following the death of his grandfather, Nilsen could often be found alone at the harbour, watching the other fishing boats going out to sea and later returning. He became much more quiet and withdrawn, not being particularly close to any of his other family members. Eventually, Nilsen would grow closer to his younger sister, Sylvia, and found comfort talking to her or playing games with her. This never filled the hole that was left in his heart after his grandfather's passing, but it provided some comfort to the young boy and kept his sister entertained, so he saw it as a worthwhile way to spend his time. A few years passed, and Nilsen continued his lonely trips to the harbour, trying to catch a glimpse of any fishing vessels. On one particular trip, Nilsen somehow became submerged under the water and was almost dragged out to sea by a strong current that he was not strong enough to swim against. Luckily for him, another young boy saw what had happened and managed to bring him ashore. Eventually, Nilsen's mother moved out of her parents' home and into a flat with her 3 children, soon finding love in the arms of a builder named Andrew Scott and having 4 more children with him. By the time Nilsen hit puberty, he had a world-altering realization when it became obvious to him that he was attracted to men and not women. Nilsen found this incredibly shameful and confusing, and so he decided to keep his sexuality hidden from all of his family members and what few friends he did have. Nilsen spent a lot of time thinking about this and came to a realization. Many of the boys that he had felt an attraction towards had similar facial features to his sister. In his already twisted young mind, He convinced himself that his feelings must have been a manifestation of the love and care that he truly felt for his younger sister, and he decided to her to find out if this was true. It is unreported if he was ever actually caught doing this. At a later date, he also caressed and the body of his older brother, Olaf Jr., as he slept, waking him and sending him into a rage. Olaf began to think that his younger brother was gay, leading him to bullying the young Nilsen and never missing an opportunity to embarrass him. It must have been a truly revolting thing to wake up to. At the age of 14, Nilsen joined the Army Cadet Force, a club hosted by the British Army for teenagers to learn about the history, culture, and structure of life for a soldier in the real army. As a side note, I myself also joined the Army Cadet Force in my teenage years. Nilsen viewed the army as a possible escape from the Scottish countryside that he had grown up in, and desperately wanted to move away from. After the young lad finished school in 1961, he found employment working in a canning factory. He used this time to think about what career he wanted for himself, and tried his hardest to reflect on what he wanted to achieve in his life. After 3 weeks, he had made up his mind. Returning home one day, he told his mother that he planned on joining the British Army, and to receive training as a chef. Nobody was surprised to hear this, given his previous love of the Army Cadet Force. Nilsen enlisted for 9 years service in September 1961, and started his training with the Army Catering Corps at St. Omer Barracks in Aldershot, Hampshire. He immediately excelled in his duties both as a soldier and as a chef, later describing his year's training as the best times of his life. While stationed at Aldershot, Nilsen's homosexual tendencies once again began to stir in his mind, but he kept this a secret from his colleagues for fear of ridicule and discrimination. He refused to shower with his fellow soldiers for fear of getting an erection in front of them, and instead opted to use the bathroom on his own. The bathroom door had a lock, and Nilsen took advantage of this to the fullest, using his bathing sessions as an opportunity to masturbate. In the year 1964, Nilsen passed his catering exam and was officially assigned to the 1st Battalion of the Royal Fusiliers in Osnabrück, West Germany. During this deployment, Nilsen became quite the heavy drinker. His colleagues noticed his increase in the use of alcohol and chalked it up to him drinking to get over his shyness. On one occasion, Nilsen met a young German boy, and they both drank until they passed out. The next day, Nilsen awoke with a pounding headache on the floor of the German's flat. They had not engaged in sex, but this incident fueled his sexual fantasies regardless. Starting from this point forward, Nilsen's fantasies always revolved around a younger, skinnier male, being completely passive and allowing Nilsen to do whatever he wanted to him. The fantasies gradually evolved into something much, much darker when he began imagining a partner to be either unconscious or dead. Following this, Nilsen made many efforts to have himself be sexually assaulted by one of his colleagues, and whenever he would drink with the other lads, he would pretend to be passed out in the hopes that one of them would make use of his supposedly unconscious body. After being deployed in West Germany for 2 years, Nilsen was eventually transferred to serve as a cook in Norway, and a year later to the state of Aden, a part of modern-day Yemen.
What are you doing switching the bloody thing on and off for? You'd never make a cameraman, you know. No. I'm not going to do anything pornographic.
This deployment was far more dangerous than anywhere he had been posted before, and Nilsen recalled losing a couple of men in ambushes on the way back to the barracks. On one occasion, Nilsen himself was kidnapped by an Arab taxi driver who took pleasure in beating him into unconsciousness. Nilsen was placed in the boot of the taxi and driven to a secluded location. As Nilsen was dragged out of the boot, surely to his death, he grabbed a jackhammer that he had found in the darkness. He used this tool to attack the taxi driver, knocking him to the ground before handing out a savage beating, leaving the taxi driver unrecognizable but alive. He then locked the Arab in the boot of the car that he himself had only just narrowly escaped from, and drove himself back to the barracks, mostly uninjured. It is unknown what happened to the taxi driver after this incident, but I'll have to assume that he was detained in the nearby British-owned Al Mansoura prison. In Nilsen's previous postings, he had shared sleeping quarters with other soldiers, but in Aden, Nilsen had his own room. Once again, just like in the bathroom during his training years, this gave him the opportunity to freely masturbate without the risk of being caught. This led him to realize that he could use a freestanding mirror to assist in visualizing himself engaged in homosexual acts with another man. He would swap between fantasies of being a dominant and passive partner. These fantasies began to involve some truly insidious stuff, such as his own near-death experience with a taxi driver, as well as the dead bodies that he had seen in Aden, and a 19th century oil painting known as the Raft of the Medusa, which shows an old man sitting atop the dismembered corpse of a man, whilst holding the limp body of a dead youth. In his personal favourite fantasy, Nilsen imagined the corpse of a young blonde soldier who had been recently killed in battle, being dominated by a dirty, dishevelled, grey-haired old man. The man washed it before having sex with the corpse. When Nilsen's deployment in Aden came to an end, he returned to the UK and was assigned to serve with the Argyll and Sutherland Highlanders at the Seaton Barracks in Plymouth, Devon. Another side note, Plymouth is my home city. Nilsen stayed at the Plymouth Barracks for only 1 year, before his unit was sent to Cyprus in 1969, and then a few months later to Berlin. During his Berlin deployment, Nilsen had his first and last consensual sexual experience with a woman, a prostitute that he had paid for. In 1971, he was reassigned to the Shetland Islands, the northernmost point of the UK, located 100 miles northeast of mainland Scotland, and 140 miles west of Norway. This is where he ended his 11-year career with the military, at the rank of corporal in October 1972.
Batteries had run out, that's why the camera went up the creek. Okay, fair enough. If you think you know how to use that, all you do is point it down and press a button.
Between October and December 1972, Nilsen lived with his family whilst he thought about what to do with his life following the army. One day he joined his older brother Olaf, his sister-in-law, and another couple to watch a documentary about gay marriage, which was outlawed in the UK at the time. Everyone present finished the presentation feeling disgusted and that their religion had been disrespected. Nilsen, however, argued in favour of gay rights. This led to a violent confrontation between Olaf and himself, culminating in Olaf telling his mother that Dennis was a homosexual and about the fondling incident from their childhood. After this, Nilsen split away from his family, never again speaking to Olaf and only keeping occasional written correspondence with his other family members, even including his own mother. He decided he wanted to join the London Metropolitan Police Force and moved to the city in December to begin the training course. In April 1973, Nilsen completed his training and was posted to Willesden Green. By August, after a failed relationship, Nilsen began to wonder whether his personal lifestyle was compatible with that of his job. During the same month, his birth father died and left an inheritance of £1,000 to each of his 3 children, which would be about £10,500 in 2024 money, about $16,000 US. In December of that year, Nilsen resigned from the police force, having served only a few months, and found employment working as a security guard. He worked this job until May 1974, when he found work as a civil servant. This role had him working in a job centre in Denmark Street. Over 4 years passed, and by late 1978, Nilsen was living a solitary existence. He had experienced at least 4 failed relationships in the last 4 years, 3 of which were in the last 18 months, and he realised that he was unfit for someone to live with. Throughout 1978, he had begun to spend almost all of his time at work, and had become an alcoholic, binging on spirits every night as he listened to music. His mental state had slipped even further into the depraved, and he began to fantasize about killing a young man so that he could keep the body for himself.
Anything good you find in this kitchen is probably attributed to my having purchased it in the first place. Bloody light doesn't even go on. Can you go back a bit? I mean, you're far too near.
As the year was coming to a close, on the 30th of December, Nilsen finally snapped. He encountered a 14-year-old boy named Stephen Holmes at the Cricklewood Arms pub, when Holmes was unsuccessfully attempting to purchase alcohol. Nilsen was drinking heavily and alone when he decided that he must leave his flat and seek a companion at any costs. Nilsen approached the teenage boy and invited him to his house with the promise of alcohol. He supposedly believed the boy to be around 17 years old. Holmes accepted, a decision that would seal his fate. When the pair got back to Nilsen's residence, they both drank heavily before falling asleep. The next morning, Nilsen woke up before Holmes and began to caress and fondle the boy in his sleep. During this despicable act, Nilsen had a sinister thought. This boy is going to stay with me over the new year, whether he wants to or not. He reached for one of his neckties, before climbing on top of the still sleeping Holmes to prevent him from escaping if he woke up. He then wrapped the tie around his throat and tightened. He strangled him until he fell unconscious before drowning the teenager with a bucket that he had filled with water. This wasn't the end of Holmes' terrible ordeal, however, even though he was already dead. Nilsen proceeded to masturbate over the corpse 2 times and then left the body on his bed whilst he waited for rigor mortis to set in. He did this so that it would be easier to move the body, which he stashed under his floorboards. This would be Holmes' resting place for almost 8 entire months. During the summer months, the smell became unbearable, and on the 11th of August, Nilsen built a bonfire in the garden behind his flat and finally disposed of the corpse. A few months later, on the 11th of October, Nilsen attempted to murder a student from Hong Kong named Andrew Ho, whom he had met at a pub on St. Martin's Lane and lured to his house with the promise of sex. Nilsen attempted to strangle Ho, who managed to break free and escape. Ho proceeded to report the incident to the police, and Nilsen was questioned about it. However, Ho changed his mind and decided not to press charges. His reasoning is unknown. 2 months after the failed murder attempt of Ho, on the 3rd of December 1979, Nilsen encountered 23-year-old Canadian student named Kenneth Oakenden, who was in England to visit some relatives. The pair met as they both drank at the bar of a pub on the West End. After Nilsen learned that the young man was a tourist, he offered to show him several London landmarks. Oakenden accepted, and unwillingly placed his life in the hands of a murderous necrophiliac. After the tour was complete, Nilsen invited the student to his house, promising him a meal with some more drinks. When later questioned about the incident, Nilsen told the police that he couldn't remember the moment where he actually strangled Oakenden, but he did recall that he did it using the cord of his headphones, as Oakenden was listening to music. After the evil deed was done, Nilsen poured himself a half glass of rum and wore the headphones that he had just used to end the poor tourist's life. Nilsen went to sleep as if nothing had ever happened, and the next day he made a trip to a photography store. Inside, he purchased a Polaroid camera and then returned home. When he got back, he began to pose the victim's corpse in various locations around the flat, and he took suggestive photos of it. Monstrous behavior. When he was finally done taking photos, he then climbed into bed and laid the corpse on top of himself whilst he watched some TV. I can only wonder what kind of weird stuff this guy was watching with a dead body resting on top of him. After Nilsen grew bored of that, he decided it was time to put the body into his personal storage and stuffed it under the floorboards. He wasn't done with it though, far from it in fact. Over the next 2 weeks, Nilsen lifted the corpse from the floorboards and seated it in the armchair beside him whilst he drank and watched TV. Nilsen took a brief break, but he had definitely not retired. On the 17th of May, he encountered a 16-year-old boy named Martin Duffy, a catering student from Merseyside, who was homeless and sleeping rough on the streets of London. Duffy had hitchhiked to London without telling his parents about it. His reason for doing this is because he had skipped a train to avoid paying, but got caught by the British Transport Police. The absolute worst thing that could have happened to him as a result of this was a very small fine, but Duffy was terrified that his parents might find out. To avoid punishment, he travelled to London, my assumption being that he had planned to start a new life in the big city. For 4 days he had been sleeping under a bench near the Euston railway station, before he had unfortunately met Nilsen, who offered him a meal and a bed for the evening. Duffy gratefully accepted, unknowingly handing himself over as Nilsen's third confirmed victim. After Duffy had fallen asleep, Nilsen sat on his chest and wrapped a ligature around the young teen's throat. He tightened it as hard as he possibly could, applying, quote, great force, in Nilsen's own words. Gripping as tightly as possible, he maintained this great force until Duffy had fully lost consciousness. Nilsen then dragged his victim into the kitchen by his throat and drowned him in the sink, before proceeding to bathe the corpse. Nilsen later recollected that the corpse was the youngest looking he had ever seen. Duffy's body was first posed on a kitchen chair, and then returned to the bed where he had initially been strangled. Nilsen, truly sickeningly, began to make out with the dead boy's corpse, whilst complimenting and caressing it as he joined it in bed. Nilsen got so turned on by this that he masturbated over the body multiple times. For the next 2 days, Nilsen stored the body in a cupboard, but then decomposition began to set in and the body started to bloat, a process that happens to dead bodies as gas trapped inside of the organs begins to expand and tries to escape. Once Nilsen had noticed this, he decided the time had come for Duffy to join Ockenden, who still remained under the floorboards almost a full 6 months later. Nilsen had grown confident by this point, and thus began to kill with increasing frequency. By the end of the year, he killed a further 5 victims and attempted to kill 1 more. That is almost 1 body for each remaining month of the year. Sadly, only one of these victims would ever be identified, William Sutherland. Later, during police interviews after he had been apprehended, Nilsen shared some details about the unidentified victims. One, who was killed sometime in November, quote, moved his legs in a cycling motion as he was strangled. On another occasion, Nilsen unsuccessfully attempted to revive the victim. When he realized he had failed, he fell to his knees in front of the mirror, and when he noticed his reflection, he spat at it aggressively. Another time, he had laid in bed with the victim before crying his eyes out to the famous song Fanfare for the Common Man. He stored all of these victims under his floorboards too. He hadn't removed any of the other corpses by this point, meaning Nilsen was effectively sleeping in a graveyard. Every night, when Nilsen got into bed, he was laying just meters away from 7 dead bodies. As you might expect, eventually the decomposing bodies began to attract insects, who were drawn in by the stench of death. Nilsen still liked to occasionally lift some of the bodies out from underneath, but he had noticed they had become infested with maggots. Some of the victims even had maggots crawling out of their eye sockets and mouths. He placed deodorants and air fresheners onto the floorboards and sprayed insecticides in his flat twice a day, but it just wasn't good enough. The flies remained, and the bodies had to go. Near the end of the year, Nilsen removed and dissected the bodies of each victim. He cut them into small, manageable pieces and smashed any large bones that he thought might be recognizable as human. He then built a large bonfire in the garden and placed paper bags containing the body parts on top of it. Finally, he crowned his twisted design with an old car tire. He thought the presence of the burning rubber would disguise the smell of burning human flesh. Somehow, this wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that 3 children had gathered to watch the fire, completely oblivious as to what they were actually witnessing. When the bonfire had burned out and was reduced to ash, Nilsen used a rake to search through the debris to see if there are any recognizable bones. After sifting for a few minutes, Nilsen discovered a fully intact skull. He smashed it with a rake, and then gathered the rest of the bone fragments and flushed them down his toilet. On the 4th of January 1981, Nilsen encountered an unidentified man at the Golden Lion pub in Soho. He referred to him as a young Scot. This man was lured to Melrose Avenue after Nilsen had challenged him to a drinking contest. He sounds Scottish to me. As the contest was taking place, Nilsen strangled the distracted Scot and placed him underneath the now vacant floorboards. On the 12th, Nilsen phoned into work and told his employer that he was sick and would need a few days off. He wasn't actually sick, well, he wasn't poorly anyway. His true intentions were to dissect and dispose of the victim, along with another unidentified man who he had murdered recently. Unfortunately, I'm unable to find any information about this victim. Nilsen had an extremely active start to 1981, and had murdered another 2 unidentified victims by April. One was described as an English skinhead that he had met in Leicester Square. The other was described by him only as Belfast Boy, a young Irishman, supposedly in his early 20s. This murder took place sometime during February. Killing had become part of Nilsen's routine by now, and he coldly described it like this: end of the day, end of the drink, end of a person. Floorboards back, carpet replaced, and back to work at Denmark Street. During May, Nilsen cut open these bodies and removed their internal organs. He threw some of these outside by his fence in the hope that animals would eat them, and placed the rest in rubbish bags that he put in the bin. The final victim to be murdered at that Melrose Avenue address was 23-year-old Malcolm Barlow. Nilsen encountered Barlow on the 17th of September 1981, slumped up against the wall of his home when he was returning home from work. He asked Barlow if he was okay, only to discover that the young man was weakened from some epilepsy medication that he had been taking. Nilsen suggested that Barlow should be in a hospital and helped him to his feet, guiding him to his flat. Once inside, Nilsen no doubt planned to murder Barlow, but for some reason he had a change of heart. Instead, he phoned 999 and asked for an ambulance to come and pick up the stranger. The following day, after Barlow had been released from hospital, he returned to Nilsen's home with the intention of thanking him for his good deed. He was invited inside, and after eating a meal, shared some drinks with Nilsen. After a night of drinks, he passed out on Nilsen's sofa. This murder differed from the ones that came before it, because Nilsen didn't use any kind of tool to help him with the strangling. Instead, he used his bare hands. After Barlow was knocked into unconsciousness, drowned and undressed, bathed and masturbated over, he was stored under the kitchen sink. In October, Nilsen's landlord contacted him and told him that he was planning to renovate the property and would need Nilsen to vacate the premises. At first, Nilsen was hesitant, but after being offered £1,000, he felt he could not refuse. On the 5th of October, he was set to move into an attic flat at 23D Cranley Gardens in the Muswell Hill district of North London. But before he could move, he had to dispose of the 2 bodies in his possession. On the 4th, the day before he was planning to move out, Nilsen built another bonfire in the garden and followed the same procedure as before. He once again masked the smell using an old car tire. At his new flat, Nilsen had no access to a garden. He also had no way of hiding corpses in his floorboards since he was on the top floor. Because of this, you may think that would prevent him from committing any more murders. And initially, for the first 2 months at least, you'd be correct in your assumption. However, after 2 months had passed, Nilsen grew restless. He needed to kill again. On the 23rd of November, he attempted to strangle a 19-year-old student named Paul Nobbs, but he stopped himself from going through with it all the way. It is unclear how he met Nobbs, or what happened to the teenager after the act. By March 1982, Nilsen had become desperate. He needed to kill again, no matter the situation. One night, he was drinking alone at a pub in Leicester Square. Here, he encountered 23-year-old John Howlett, and when the pub was closing down for the night, Nilsen invited him back to his flat in order to continue drinking. Once both men had arrived at Nilsen's new property, they continued to drink and watched a movie together. After the movie had ended, Howlett walked into Nilsen's front room where the bed was located and passed out. 1 hour passed and Nilsen unsuccessfully tried to wake Howlett from his slumber. He stood up, poured himself a glass of rum and sat down to drink it, preparing himself for what he knew he was about to do. As Nilsen began to strangle Howlett, he awoke and a massive fight ensued. Howlett defended himself valiantly, managing to turn the tables and even managed to start strangling Nilsen too. Unfortunately for him, fast movement only served to drain his own oxygen, and since Nilsen had started strangling him first, he also was sadly the first to pass out. As Howlett fell into unconsciousness, Nilsen returned to his sofa and sat down for a moment, shaking from the stress of the near-death experience. He wondered if anybody living in the flat beneath him had heard anything. Over the next 10 minutes, Nilsen noticed that Howlett was still breathing and attempted to finish the job by choking him some more with an upholstery strap. This was unsuccessful, so Nilsen dragged his victim into the bathroom and drowned him in the bathtub. For over a week following the murder, Howlett's finger marks were visible on Nilsen's throat. Some time passed, and in May 1982, Nilsen came across Carl Stotter, a 21-year-old gay man, at the Black Cat pub in Camden. Nilsen struck up a conversation with Stotter, discovering that he was deeply upset at the ending of a failed relationship. After buying the 21-year-old a few drinks, Nilsen invited him back to his flat, promising that he had no plans for making sexual advances on him. At the flat, Stotter drank some more before falling asleep in a sleeping bag that Nilsen had provided him. Some time later, he awoke to find Nilsen strangling him. Their eyes made contact, and Nilsen commanded Stotter to stay still, and then everything returned to black. Some more time passed, and Stotter once again awoke, but this time to the sound of running water, before realizing that he was submerged and Nilsen was trying to drown him. Stotter forced his head above the water and blurted out the words, "No more, please, no more." Nilsen ignored this and once again submerged the young man's head under the water. Believing that he had killed Stotter, Nilsen seated him in his armchair. It was at this point that he noticed his dog, Bleep, starting to lick Stotter's face. He realized that Stotter was somehow still alive. Nilsen rubbed his limbs and chest to increase the blood circulation, and covered his body in blankets and then laid him on top of his bed. Eventually Stotter regained consciousness, and Nilsen hugged him. Nilsen explained that he had almost strangled himself on the zip of the sleeping bag, and that he had tried to resuscitate him after. Over the next 2 days, Stotter faded in and out of consciousness. Once he had gained enough strength to question Nilsen about the incident, he asked why he remembered being strangled and then drowned. Nilsen explained that he had become caught in the zip of the sleeping bag while suffering from a nightmare, and that he had placed him in cold water because he was in shock. The following day, Nilsen led Stotter to a nearby railway station, where he bid the young man farewell. In June 1982, Nilsen was promoted to executive officer at his workplace and was transferred to a different job centre in Kentish Town. 3 months after his promotion, on the 6th of October, he came across a 27-year-old named Graham Aden attempting to hail a taxi in Shaftesbury Avenue. Nilsen asked if Alan would like to accompany him to Cranley Gardens for a meal. As Alan sat, eating an omelette, Nilsen approached him from behind. He strangled Alan, as with the other victims, and then drowned him in the bathtub. He left Alan in the bath for 3 days before dissecting the body on his kitchen floor. Nilsen managed to hold back his urge to kill for another 3 months. On the 26th of January 1983, Nilsen came across a 20-year-old heroin addict named Stephen Sinclair. Sinclair was spotted by an acquaintance in the company of Nilsen, heading to an underground railway station. At Nilsen's flat, Sinclair passed out from the effects of heroin and alcohol in an armchair, whilst Nilsen observed and listened to The Who. Nilsen approached Sinclair, and kneeling before him, he whispered to himself, "Oh, Stephen, here I go again." He then viciously strangled the troubled youth to death with a custom-made ligature constructed using a necktie and a rope. At this point, Nilsen noticed bandages on each of his victims' wrists. Removing them revealed that Sinclair had recently attempted to kill himself by deeply slashing each one. After Nilsen had completed his usual ritual of undressing and bathing the body, he applied talcum powder to it as well. He placed 3 mirrors around the bed before stripping down himself, laying down alongside the victim. After several hours of furious masturbation, Nilsen kissed the corpse on the forehead before saying, "Good night, Stephen." He then fell asleep with the body. Eventually, Nilsen also dissected this body and put various dismembered body parts into different plastic bags. He stored these bags all over his flat, one went into a wardrobe, another into a tea chest, and a few more into a drawer under the sink in his bathroom. He sealed these bags using the bandages that were covering Sinclair's slit wrists. Nilsen attempted to dispose of the flesh and smaller bones of all 3 victims in the property by flushing them down the toilet. He also boiled the heads, hands, and feet of the victims in order to remove any flesh and make them harder to identify. Less than 2 weeks had passed since the death of Sinclair, when the drains in the property had become blocked. This rather annoyed Nilsen, because the smell had become unbearable, and the sentiment was shared by everybody living below him too. He wrote a letter of complaint to his estate agent, mentioning that the drains were blocked and that the situation for the other tenants and himself had become unbearable. Soon, a diner road employee, a company that works in drainage and plumbing, named Michael Catran, was sent to investigate what could be causing the blockage. The employee opened up a drain cover at the side of the house, and was surprised to notice it was packed with a flesh-like substance and numerous small bones of unknown origin. Catran promptly reported this suspicious discovery to his supervisor, Gary Wheeler. Wheeler advised Catran to postpone any further investigation and to look into it the following morning, since he had turned up at the property during the evening time. As Catran was about to leave, Nilsen struck up a conversation with him in order to discuss the source of the substance. Once Nilsen heard Catran mention how the substance looked like human flesh, he responded with, "It looks like someone has been flushing their Kentucky Fried Chicken down the toilet." The next morning at 7:30 a.m, both Catran and his supervisor, Wheeler, arrived at the property. By this point, the drain had been completely cleared. This further aroused the suspicions of both men, and they decided to check the pipes that connected the drain to the house. Within the pipe that connected to the top floor of the house, they were disgusted to find even more human remains. Both Catran and Wheeler agreed that the bones looked like they belonged to a human hand. They both withdrew from the property and contacted the police. When the police turned up, they began to investigate further. The police then found more small bones and scraps of what they also agreed looked like human flesh. These remains were taken to the mortuary at Hornsey, where the pathologist David Bowen let the police know that the remains were indeed human. Detective Chief Inspector Peter J. and his colleagues returned to the property, where they spoke to some tenants, hoping to ascertain who lived in the top floor flat. After learning that Dennis Nilsen lived up there, the officers opted to wait outside for Nilsen to return from work. When Nilsen did return, DCI-J introduced himself to the despicable serial necrophiliac. He explained that they were here to investigate the blockage in the drains from his flat. Nilsen feigned confusion and inquired as to why the police officers were investigating this matter. He also asked if the two other officers with Jay were health inspectors. Jay informed Nilsen that the other two were also police officers, and requested access to the flat to discuss the matter in more detail. Nilsen led the three officers into his flat, and the stench of decay and death became immediately apparent to all three officers. Nilsen was beginning to become quite panicked, and asked them once again why they were interested in his drains. Jay informed him that the blockage was made by decaying human remains. Nilsen pretended to be shocked, but Jay wasn't going to have any of that, and responded, "Don't mess about. Where's the rest of the body?" At this point, Nilsen realized that he had been caught, and there was no use lying anymore. He pointed to a wardrobe, and coldly admitted that the rest of the body could be found inside, in 2 plastic bags. As the officers approached, they were overwhelmed by the smell of decomposition. They didn't open the wardrobe, but asked Nilsen if there were any other body parts in the flat, or anywhere else that he may have hidden them. Nilsen told them it's a long story, it goes back a long time. "I'll tell you everything, I want to get it off my chest, but not here, at the police station."
The mass had mysteriously disappeared from the manhole.
So on Tuesday night there was a lot of flesh, a lot of meat in the manhole. And when you went back on Wednesday morning, it had all gone?
Yeah, completely. If a manhole can be sparkling, it was sparkling.
And this was it for the kindly killer. Following this confession, he was arrested under suspicion of murder and transported to the Hornsey police station, where they could hopefully get something more formal out of him. During the drive there, one of the officers asked Nilsen whether the remains in his flat belonged to just one person or two. Nilsen stared out the window of the car for the entire journey, and eventually responded, 15 or 16 since 1978. This would be the last time the deranged lunatic would ever be able to see the world from outside of a cell. Whilst Nilsen was safely locked up in police custody, a fellow officer, Detective Superintendent Chambers, joined DCIJ and a third detective, and they returned to his flat in order to collect the plastic bags that allegedly contained the body parts of the victims. Once they arrived, the trio made their way upstairs to the top floor flat. Upon gaining entry, the officers made their way to the wardrobe. If they thought the smell of decay was overwhelming before they opened the door, then they were in for a shock once it had been opened. The men gathered the bags and headed out to the Hornsey mortuary. Once they had been handed in, the officers were informed that one bag was found to contain 2 dissected human torsos, one of which had been sliced vertically, and a shopping bag containing a mixture of internal organs. The second bag contained 2 human heads, one entirely devoid of any flesh at all, and a third torso with arms attached, but missing its hands. One final detail the mortician added on was that both heads had been found to have been boiled. On the 10th of February 1983, Dennis Nilsen confessed to his crimes in a police interview. Based on information he gave in this interview, further searches of Cranley Gardens were carried out, where police discovered the lower section of a torso and 2 legs stored in one bag in the bathroom, with another bag containing a skull, a torso, and various bones found in the tea chest. Nilsen also travelled to his old home at Melrose Avenue with the police, where the killings had begun, and pointed to the locations in a garden where he had built the bonfires to burn the victims. Back at the mortuary, Bowen was able to confirm that the fingerprints on one of the bodies matched those on the police file for Stephen Sinclair. At 5:40 p.m. on the 11th of February 1983, Dennis Nilsen was formally charged with the murder of Stephen Sinclair. Formal questioning of Nilsen began that same evening, with Nilsen agreeing to be represented by a solicitor. This seems entirely pointless to me, seeing as he had already confessed to 16 killings, with multiple corpses being found in his possession. Over the following few days, police interviewed Nilsen on 16 separate occasions, totaling over 30 hours. Once the victim had been killed, Nilsen had some ritualistic behaviours that he usually engaged in. First, he bathed the corpse and shaved any hair from the torso. Once the body was clean and dry, he applied makeup to hide any scars or injuries. The corpse was then dressed in socks and underwear before being draped over Nilsen himself. He would then talk to the corpse for hours. Nilsen explained to the police that his victims were, quote, too perfect and beautiful for the pathetic ritual of commonplace sex. He kept the bodies of any victims killed at his previous address for as long as decomposition would allow, and upon noticing any obvious signs, he would store them under the floorboards. Before they started to decompose, however, he would stand or lay beside the bodies whilst masturbating for hours. When it came to dissecting the bodies, Nilsen would always start off by masturbating next to the corpse, no matter how badly decomposed it was. Remember earlier when I said the victims had maggots coming out of their mouths and eyeballs? Yeah. This was supposed to be his final goodbye to the victim, before the dismemberment began. This would usually make Nilsen puke, and he would have to get drunk first to gather the nerves to follow through with this disgusting act. Nilsen finally explained that he took no pleasure in the act of killing, but he did, quote, worship the art and the act of death. After the interview process was complete, the kindly killer was transported to HMP Brixton to be held on remand until his trial began. On the 24th of October, Nilsen was finally brought to trial at the Old Bailey and was charged with 6 counts of murder and 2 of attempted murder. After a 10-day trial, Nilsen was found guilty of all 6 counts of murder and of 1 count of attempted murder. He was sentenced to a lifetime in prison. Following his conviction, Nilsen was transferred to HMP Wormwood Scrubs to serve his sentence. This is where he remained until 2003, when he was transferred to HMP Full Sutton, where he remained incarcerated as an ACAT prisoner until his death on the 12th of May 2018. Okay guys, this video took an incredibly long time to research and write, so if you learned anything or found it informative at all, then please drop a like. It really does show support. It helps the videos get spread around to more people, and in turn helps the channel grow. If you want to see my next video, make sure you subscribe, because I'll be posting a new documentary soon, so if you subscribe you'll be able to see it as soon as it goes live. I post true crime content as often as I possibly can, and if you enjoyed this video then I'm sure you'll enjoy my other content too. Leave a comment down in the comment section below as well. I reply to all of them. I read every comment, so it'd be awesome to see or to hear any of your thoughts about this disgusting case. Other than that, yeah, thank you very much for watching, and see you next time.